This is Captains of Industry. Let's go back to your early corporate days, and I see from perusing your CV that those early days were characterized by lots and lots of ideas emanating from yourself.
Yeah, it was actually during my articles initially when I became preoccupied with getting into business. I have to confess that like most school leavers, when I was about to leave school, I was somewhat unsighted as to what I wanted to do in my career. I then decided to study a BCom, which was a general business degree, and it was actually mixing with a lot of people during those early years who you could see were getting ideas in terms of doing entrepreneurial things, or even getting involved in other aspects of business, that I decided that it was probably the line that I wanted to go into.
So from your articles at Ernst & Young, you had a brief foray into the IT industry and then into the platinum mining industry. What ultimately made you decide that platinum was the place that you were going to stay, having joined Impala Platinum in 1999?
Well, I think it was really, there was push and pull factors at the time. The IT industry, if you remember, we had the dot-coms. And I have to say, being an accountant, and hopefully accountants are sort of have a practical base to them, was that I got to a point where I couldn't really identify with the industry anymore. There seemed to be a lot of hot air in the industry, and certainly I wanted to get back to something that was more real. And if you know the term, the old economy or the real economy, I felt I wanted to get my teeth stuck into something that was more akin to the real world.
Well, platinum is all about the real world, and certainly you're in an industry that plays a big role in South Africa's economy, with 80% of the world's platinum supply coming directly out of South Africa. You're a heavyweight in the platinum industry, so to speak. How does that make you feel? Because people must take you seriously.
Well, I think we're very blessed here in South Africa. I mean, quite clearly, as you rightly pointed out, we have about 80% of the world resources, and currently have about a similar percentage of the world's platinum production coming out of South Africa. So I think that puts us in a very unique position, and it's probably quite easy to get carried away thinking about one being a heavyweight in the industry. But I think we are very fortunate that we have a restricted industry in terms of the supply and the resource base, and therefore that makes it quite an enjoyable industry to be part of.
Let's talk specifically about Impala Platinum. You've got 230 million attributable platinum ounces, and that's spread between Zimbabwe and South Africa, with 43% of those attributable ounces based in Zimbabwe. There's a lot of value to unlock there. It is a problem that has plagued Impala Platinum, given the fact that the Zimbabwean government still looks set on taking 51% shareholding in miners in its territory. It must be keeping you awake at night.
Well, I think that's quite a complex question that you've asked. I think there's many facets to it. I think first of all, there's an old adage that when I first went into the mining industry, is that one of my peers told me, is that unfortunately you have to go where the ore body is. It's not like other industries where you can uproot and you can move manufacturing bases and labour bases, etc. Unfortunately, in the mining, the ore body dictates where you're going to be mining. And as you quite rightly point out, there is a significant amount of our resource base that is in Zimbabwe. Having said that, I think one must bear in mind that we've been operating there now for close on a decade. We first got involved in late 2000, early 2001, and I suppose from that point of view, having been involved for such a long time in that part of the world, I suppose we now have an understanding on how it works. The government, you are right, have obviously recently legislated an indigenisation bill that obviously will require us to have a look at. I think, though, maybe stepping back a little bit, we're not against indigenisation per se. I think the issue that we've always maintained that we've had is that the 51%, and if 51% is an equity participation, quite clearly it's something of concern. And the reason it's a concern is because there's a whole host of practical issues that actually emanate from such legislation. And I suppose from our point of view, we're in the process of working with government to get a better understanding and to see how this bill will impact in terms of businesses going forward.
Looking at Australia and the recent news flow out of that territory, would that be a better solution in your opinion? Australia looking at a 40% tax on resource profits to be introduced just in the near future?
Well, I think at the moment what we're seeing is there is a balance or a battle between governments ensuring that they get sufficient value for their natural resources, and let's be honest, the natural resources belong to the countries in which those resources reside. They've obviously seen a significant commodity boom take place in the previous 10 years, and I suppose it's a question of trying to get that balance between a fair reward for both providers of capital as well as for the countries who own the resources. In terms of taxation, my view is that that's probably a better direct route. There's probably more equality in that process, and effectively everyone has a level playing field. So I'd probably prefer that as a route than going the other type of routes that we've seen mooted.
And what about South Africa's solution, and that is a revenue royalty bill?
Well, I think the revenue bill, or should we say a royalty based on revenue, for me, has some obvious issues, because quite clearly that doesn't necessarily take into account operating expenditure, and I think different mines have different operating expenditure levels. And quite clearly what you are doing is, I suppose the state is saying, because we own the assets, we're going to take the cream off the top. But unfortunately, I don't think it necessarily understands or takes into account the capital requirements and also the operational requirements and needs of each individual mine. So I think revenue taxes for me are somewhat difficult to vote for, because I obviously think it should be based on in terms of after your operating profit, like normal corporate taxes.
Electricity problems, and we saw the scarcity of electricity supply impact the platinum miners across the board in South Africa in March 2008, and we saw platinum going to all-time highs above that $2,200 an ounce level. Are we over in terms of problems associated with electricity, to put it that way?
Well, I think the short answer is no. I certainly believe that what we have seen is, because of the economic downturn back end of 2008 and through 2009, that reduction in economic activity has given us some breathing space. But what it hasn't done is it hasn't taken away the problem. And certainly from my perspective is I think we will see the problems re-emerge probably back end of 2010, early 2011, as we see an uptick in economic activity again within South Africa. I think the pity is that we probably lost a period of time when we actually could have been getting on with addressing the issues, and I think we've lost some traction in this last sort of 18-month period.
Have you investigated alternative energy supply sources?
Well, we have looked at it. I think the issue at the end of the day is, as a mining company, one has to make a decision. Is electricity generation part of our core business?
It's certainly fundamental to your mines operating, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's fundamental, but is it core? And quite clearly, you've always heard the old adage again that, as a business, you must concentrate on your knitting. And must concentrate on the things that you're good at, and the things that we're good at is mining and producing platinum. Producing electricity, I'm not quite sure that that's our forte. But having said that, I think the other raft of issues that came out is that between Eskom and potential private producers of electricity, we haven't formulated the framework and regulatory framework that will allow us, I think, to get power onto the grid. Plus the fact is there's a time period. If you were to start now to generating electricity, will still take some period of time. So therefore it doesn't necessarily solve your problem in the short term. I think the other aspect is you have to look at cost. And quite clearly, I think to generate independent power is probably quite a costly exercise. We did look, and particularly back in March 2008, we looked at a number of, shall we say, a variety of possibilities that we could actually look at. And I think for us, the one that kind of made the most sense is probably not own and operate a power station, but look at securing some kind of offtake agreement from someone who would produce power.
Dave, for the 2009 financial year, production for platinum sitting at 1.7 million ounces. You've stated that you want to achieve 2.1 million ounces by 2014. What is going to take you to that additional production?
Well, I think there's three sources. The first source comes from Impala Rustenburg, which is our main operating area. Currently, we're sort of to produce 870,000 platinum ounces for the year to June 2010. We're looking at moving that back to 1 million ounces during that reporting period. We're also looking at Zimplats. As you know, despite the obvious difficulties there, we're ramping up or successfully commissioned phase 1, and we'll have ramped up by June 2010 up to 180,000 ounces. That's an additional 90,000 as well. Plus, the fact is, through Impala Refining Services, we treat material for third-party miners where we don't necessarily have an interest in the hole in the ground or the physical mine itself, but those projects will be ramping up as well.
The exchange rate, all miners have been impacted negatively by the strong rand, and certainly currency commentators feel that 2010 could also be about a strong South African rand. Again, is this one of those things that keeps you awake? There's not much you can do about the exchange rate. I'm not sure of your hedging policies.
We don't hedge. We're an unhedged producer both in metal terms and in terms of the rand-dollar exchange rate. I think your point is right. It doesn't necessarily keep me awake at night because there's not a hell of a lot we can do about it. But having said that, I see that there's very strong calls for a weakening of the rand. I think the difficulty with that is that the, shall we say, the headwinds that are against a weakening rand are very, very strong. And I agree with your sentiment that we are more than likely going to see a continued strong rand during 2010 into 2011. And in fact, the interesting point is, despite dollar metal prices having recovered quite significantly over the last 8 or 9 months, in rand terms, we're actually not making as much as we were, say, 12 or 15 months ago. So it is having an impact on the business. And in fact, interesting enough, in Zimbabwe, where we import a lot of our input costs come through South Africa into Zimbabwe, because of the strength of the rand against the US dollar, we are seeing an impact on input costs as well.
How much time do you spend debating the dollar platinum price?
Well, I think quite clearly the supply and demand fundamentals impact that dollar metal price quite significantly. So we spend quite a lot of time debating the metal price. But from our perspective, I suppose we're not only concerned about today's dollar metal price, but what the dollar metal price will be in 5 or 10 years out. Because the issue is, for us, is to try and balance the supply and demand equations.
Which must be relatively difficult to do given the exchange-traded funds and their impact on the demand side that is fueled by investors and potentially speculation.
Well, I think what has taken place is, if we looked in 2009, without a doubt the Chinese jewelry sector was a saviour for the platinum industry, and in fact that helped to buoy prices quite nicely, and in fact the offtake was actually very, very strong during 2009. Creeping into 2010 calendar year, you're right, the electronic trading funds and the investment demand obviously helped to buoy price. Quite clearly, from our point of view, obviously a return of demand fundamentals in terms of industrial demand fundamentals is something that could be quite vital for us to ensure that we continue to push the metal prices going forward. I think what we look upon the physical demand and the investor demand really is just along the lines of a lockup of metal. It's another demand element, and we certainly believe that will come out at some time in the future.